Howdy there, folks. Welcome into today's video. Got some big news on several different fronts I want to share with you in this video here today. I got some good news, some very good news, and I also have some bad news to share with you in this video. Hope you guys enjoyed as always. Thank you for being subscribed here. Appreciate you all as always. First off, all this recession talk, complete baloney, okay? Look at this. Iggy news is out here. Made $300,000 in 24 hours on our OnlyFans debut. Holy smokers, that ain't no jokers, man. $300,000 in 24 hours. Imagine that, man. Imagine that. Yeah, I don't know. They talk about recession this, recession that, and you got stuff like this going on. Holy smokers. Thanks, everybody that supports on Patreon over Iggy's OnlyFans there. I appreciate y'all. Oh, my goodness, okay? Alrighty, guys, first up here. So this was sent to me just a bit ago here. This looks at Tesla's total U.S. inventory, and it is dropping off a cliff. As soon as basically the news came out that they were dropping, obviously, price, plus obviously you get that new tax credit here as of the start of this year. Yeah, inventory is plummeting. Now, the interesting thing of this is, one is, I wouldn't be surprised if inventory gets completely depleted. At the rate things are going here, I wouldn't be surprised if inventory gets completely depleted here over the next, like, let's call it week. The second component I think is very important to think about here is a lot of people that go to buy a Tesla aren't buying, like inventory that's out there, existing inventory, right? They want to customize this and that. They want to customize the rims, and they want a certain paint, and they want a certain interior look, and all these sorts of things, right? So many times, like, folks aren't even considering whatever's out there for existing inventory. Many times they're doing new orders, right? And as somebody that has bought 3 Teslas over time, right? My first ever Tesla was a Model 3 Performance Edition. I didn't go to existing inventory. I customized it, right? My second Tesla ever was my Model X. Same thing. I didn't go to existing inventory. I picked everything out myself. And the last one was a Model S Plaid, right? And same exact situation. I picked it all out. So a lot of people don't even consider looking at Tesla inventory. So I think that's another factor that, they could have orders coming insanely strong right now, and we're not even going to get to see it because of, obviously inventory. The thing to keep an eye on over the next couple of weeks is how far out do maybe, let's call it basically when you get the vehicle, how far out does that push out? Does it start to push out to it takes you a week to get it, 2 weeks to get it, a month to get it, 2 months to get it? That's going to be an interesting, thing to keep an eye on there. And if you're wondering who's buying all these Teslas in a recession, I don't know, the same people that paid Iggy $300,000 in 24 hours, maybe. Okay. Next up here, this is important. I saw this actually on Twitter, and I thought this was important to show you guys this. Okay, office building, 100,000 square feet, purchase price $100 million. Rent $8 million gross, year 2019. Now half vacant, rent $4 million a year. Cost to operate $2.4 million a year. Interest on the loan, $3 million a year. Owner losing $1.4 million a year. $40 million down, payment wiped out. And no tenant interest happening all over the country. And this is something that is definitely playing out right now. And I'm going to show you something in just a moment that I think is way bigger than this, that's going to potentially transpire here that I think everybody has to keep an eye on, right? And remember, I told you I had some bad news to share with you. And this is something we're going to see play out more in terms of these office buildings that just aren't needed the way they used to be needed prior to Rona, right? And keep in mind, we haven't even really seen unemployment go up in any significant way. We haven't even seen like the sorts of layoffs you might see down the road, right? And so that's something to keep in mind. Like, think about all the folks that have taken out these sorts of loans, and my gosh, like, what happens if those loans aren't paid back, right? And the owner's losing this, and if it's an owner that can afford that, that's one thing. But what happens if it's an owner that goes into bankruptcy, right? And that loan's defaulted on? Well, now the bank has to take that, and the bank would be, obviously, or whoever loaned the money is going to have to be the one that takes the huge hit on that in the end, right? Because the owner could just file bankruptcy, but as there's a great saying, right? You owe, I don't know, the bank a few $1,000s. That's your problem, right? You owe the bank $100 million. That's the bank's problem. That's a great saying, and it's the truth, right? Because they're the ones that ends up having to take the huge hit on that if this is something that happens, right? And at some point in time, if you're the owner and you're losing a fortune on this, at some point in time, it might make sense to walk away. As in the great financial crisis, people walked away from their homes, right? People forget that. Like, people put down payments down on homes and walked away. Why'd they walk away? Because the value of the home was massively less. And many times they couldn't afford the payments anymore, especially if it was something that ballooned, right? And sometimes these situations can happen that you didn't transpire. I'm sure when that person bought the office building for $100 million, right? And they put $40 million down, I'm sure they weren't even probably considering this sort of scenario where they only had half the building full, right? And they have immense operating problems, right? In terms of cost to operate basically the building itself. I'm sure they weren't considering that. I'm sure they might have been considering like maybe your rent stays flat or something like that, or maybe goes down slightly, but not drops to a 50% decline, while the cost to operate is immense. And next thing you know, they're losing $1 million plus a year. And so I think that's something that's to play in there. But I think there could be potentially bigger issues in that, right? Remember, everybody was so mad a year ago, 2 years ago, about all these companies buying all these homes, right? And as I watched that play out, I said, okay, all these companies are buying homes. Do you realize all these companies could be setting themselves up for an epic collapse and an epic amount of defaults, essentially? Because imagine you're these companies, right? These companies were buying homes left and right at pretty much sky-high prices, right? Well, guess what? These same companies could be put into situations where they're going to have to default. Imagine if they don't have the renters out there. Or imagine if they have to rent their properties for substantially less than what they thought they were going to be able to rent those properties for. Oh, that's something they didn't even consider. When a lot of these companies were going to buy these homes, what they were considering is a perfect scenario where rents keep going up or stay about where they've been, and they're able to, and home prices keep appreciating, and everything's grand. They never took into account, what if rents fall? That's something I personally have taken into account. And I have rented one of my properties, and I can tell you, I rented that under what the market rate was supposed to be. And the reason being is I wanted to generate a good amount of interest in qualified folks, right? And, those folks wanted to rent for a long period of time. And I said, that's perfectly fine. And the reason I said that is because I'm willing to risk the fact that I think there's a decent probability that rents could decline over the next 1 to 2 years. It might not happen, but I think there's a decent probability that will happen. And especially in red hot markets like my properties in either Arizona or Vegas, right? And so I said, I'd rather be safe than sorry in this situation. But people like me are not the norm. These corporations cannot afford to do what I did there. They cannot afford that. And they will have to dump properties at mass at bad prices and take huge losses, or face bankruptcy, which once again then goes back to the creditors. And those folks have to dump these houses at obviously massive discounts. And so I watched a lot of people get very frustrated by that whole situation. And I was just watching and I'm like, it comes back around. It comes back around. So those corporations look so greedy. You might understand they're gonna basically eat themselves. And you just don't realize it at that moment. And so I think that's a factor that a lot of people haven't even considered here. And you're starting to see it play out in this office situation. But the next step could very well be these massive landlords that bought up properties at sky-high rates. And those properties, I can tell you what, all those properties those companies bought are already worth, in reality, 10 to 30% less. That's reality. These numbers that you, from government data, blah, 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 complete baloney. As somebody that's, has properties and try to sell a property and, went through it and speaks to countless realtors, I'm telling you, these homes these folks bought are already 10 to 30% underwater. And they haven't even really taken the hit when it comes to the rent situation. But if unemployment starts to climb in any significant way, they will take the hit on that. You want to see some more bad data? Let me show you this. This is the annual mortgage cost as a percentage of household income, okay? So somebody sent me this as well, and I was just like, wow, that's insane. This is a huge, huge, huge problem. Worse than prior to the great financial crisis, essentially, right? Here was great. If you bought a home in these years, you did likely very well for yourself, right? You were in a normalized market, everything was good. Lately, because of obviously the basically the interest you're going to pay on your mortgage now, compound it with sky-high home prices, compound it with folks have not been able to offset that with their wages and things like that, and plus inflation's killed a lot of folks' budgets outside of that. We're in a situation now at this point in time that we're at extremely, extremely unhealthy amounts of folks' household income going to a mortgage cost. It's unsustainable. It will come down, and we will get more into normal ranges. It will happen, and it's going to happen over the next couple of years, essentially. That's not a good thing for the housing market, I can tell you that. It's also not a good thing for the overall economy, but certainly not a good thing for the housing market. And this is one of just many various reasons on why I have been very bearish on real estate. I told folks, everybody I know personally, don't buy a house in 2022. I feel the same way about 2023. I don't buy a house in 2023 unless you're desperate. If you're desperate, okay, I can understand. 2024, we can talk. 2024, we can talk. I'll probably be in the market for a new real estate investment property in 2024, in 2025. Not right now. It's not the time. Be patient. Patience pays off in the real estate market. This real estate market lags the stock market sometimes for years. Years, not months, years the real estate market lags. It will all come to you, okay? Next thing up here. I thought this was interesting. Thousands of elite will fly into Davos on private jets this week to discuss how regular people should stop consuming so much. If this was really about saving the planet, why don't they do a conference over Zoom, right? And this is something that I see out there a lot. And it's an interesting thought, right, about these ultra-rich folks. And many of these folks being these same folks that tell you, we got to watch this about the climate and this and that, but yet they're flying around in private jets and in all this lifestyle stuff, right? And my opinion of this is, first off, I understand folks' frustration and a kind of obsession about the rich flying around in private jets, but then preaching that you need to be good for the climate and those sorts of things, right? But not just that. You got to understand human psychology, because these same folks that are flying on the private jets, they're the same folks that they view it as this is part of the problem over here. This is part of the problem over here, but me just flying my private jet, I'm not being part of the problem. We got much of a bigger problem over here, and that's the way they view it, right? And many times, it's easier to kind of pass the buck, right? And it's easier to say, all you people are the problem, me flying in my private jet's not the problem, right? And I'll give it to you kind of like this, right? If you remember, Bernie Sanders, extremely popular with the college folks when he was running, several years ago, right? And Bernie Sanders was an individual that basically said you're going to get free health care, you're going to get free college, this and that, right? And all these promises and those sorts of things. And of course, college students specifically loved Bernie Sanders. He ate that stuff up. Why? Well, college students don't make much money, right? So they don't care about taxes, and if everybody's going to get taxed a ton more, it doesn't affect them, right? And they're also in college and probably paying a fortune, and they would love free college, right? And they would love free health care and all those things. So somebody like Bernie Sanders, that resonates there. And they're not worried about all the ramifications of that, right? Maybe when they get older and they start making, a few $100,000s a year, they're going to start looking at the government differently and be like, wait, why are you taking all my money? Why are you taking 35% of my money? Why are you taking 40%? Bernie Sanders, I think, was talking about even 60, 70% tax rates, some crazy tax rates, right? And once those folks start to make some money, they start to look at it differently. No different than these folks look at this and they say, a big deal. I'm flying around in my private jet. Well, I'm not really, I'm like this much of a problem in terms of, global climate issues, right? It's the same exact philosophy. It's just used in reverse. And it is the way it is. I don't know any other way to put it than that. It is the way it is. And people will always look at it as these folks over here are the problem. I'm not the problem. It's them over there. It's the way it's always been, and it's probably the way it will always be. Just to be quite frank. So, you can get frustrated about it and these sorts of things, but you got to understand, it will always be that way. People are always looking out for themselves over everybody else. And then they'll say, you're not doing your right thing. That's just the way it is, okay? Next thing up here, Toby. If you don't know Toby, he's the founder and leader of Shopify, which is obviously a stock that's been absolutely devastated, but it's been a great company over the past decade, and likely has a very exciting next decade in front of it. And he tweeted out something interesting recently, and I saw this gentleman actually retweeted it, and that's how it actually showed up on my Twitter feed here, essentially. Okay, corporations hate non-quantifiable because you cannot create process with it. And most companies cannot execute things that cannot be stated as fully quantifiable process. You can improve almost everything by allowing non-quantifiables to factor in. And I'll put it simply like this, right? Big companies are scared to take any sorts of risks with their business models many times. And the reason is many times they can't quantify that, right? And if it's a difficult thing to get a bureaucratic company to do something kind of game-changing. Now, this is where startups come in, right? And startups are able to do things that these big companies could never do because big companies move slow, they're scared to make moves, they're very bureaucratic, right? And a lot of times they don't want to do something that they can't quantify, right? And so I think the point he makes is very important here. And I think something that Toby's trying to do with Shopify, right, as they get bigger and bigger over the coming years, is make sure they don't fall into that problem, right? Now, Shopify will one day fall into that problem. I don't think it's quite yet, but I can tell you someday they will fall into that. All companies do, including Tesla will fall into that category one day. They're not there yet, but they will fall into the category. Apple's fallen into it recently over the past decade, once Steve Jobs left. I think Amazon's going to fall into it as well. It doesn't mean you can't be a great stock. You can still be a great stock, make a ton of money, make investors a ton of money. But in terms of being that game-changing company, it starts to slowly die over time, right? And you just see it time and time again with these corporations, right? And even Amazon, with Jeff Bezos leaving the company, don't be surprised if Amazon, becomes much more of a profit-focused company over the next decade than they were in the last decade, right? And don't be surprised if they don't take many huge risks anymore at this point in time, right? And they only do the things that they can quantify right there and be able to put it on a piece of paper and say, this makes sense to do this. Smaller companies can take much more risk. That's the way it is. That's the way it always will be, right? And so I appreciate Toby's kind of thoughts here because I think it's a big subject that not a lot of people think about, and they honestly should think about, okay? So anyways, hope you guys enjoyed today's video. As always, I appreciate everybody joining me. Much love. Thanks for being subscribed to the channel. Thanks everybody that supports the channel on Patreon. I appreciate each and every one of you as always, and have a great day.